start us off. So welcome. We're in the 6th of our 7-part series, mini lectures. The title, Women in Science at McGill. And as you all know, this series is made possible through the generous support of Dr. Lauren Trottier. McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. At the end of the series, you will be able to view all the archived webcasts. Thank you, Stuart, and the people at ICS for taping this series for us. Please turn off any devices that might disturb the speaker. There might be a brief interruption from the intercom located in this room. That'll be about 5 minutes before 7. We have no way of turning it off. We basically ignore it. We will stop because you can't actually hear the speaker over and above it. So we'll be doing that tonight. Don't forget to go online for the background readings. You'll find them on the Mini Science website. That's the URL. Just Google Mini Science McGill. It'll pop up right away. All the speakers in this series have provided us with readings, with introductions to their work as scientists, and all these readings accent and enhance aspects of what you hear at the presentations here. Our moderator tonight is Alison Gonzalez. She is an assistant professor of sociocultural studies of science education and the director of science education laboratories. Her areas of interest include science education, gender studies, sociocultural issues in science education, teacher education, identity studies, and informal education. Her current research focuses on sociocultural theories of identity and learning to explore various forms of, quote, science talk, informal and informal learning spaces. She researches the gendering of physics discourses and the implications this has for students' engagement and identity construction in the practices of the various disciplinary subfields of physics. She is also involved in research that focuses on talking about gender and physics. Alison will now introduce our speaker for tonight.
Hi, everyone. So I'm very excited to be here for this talk. And I'm very pleased to introduce Elena Bennett, who is the Stacy Fellow in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences and the McGill School of the Environment, both. And she's going to talk about women in sustainability science and the environment. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the work that Elena's been doing. She's been at McGill since 2005, and she's presently engaged in 3 very interesting and important research projects. One is called Seeds of the Good Anthropocene. This is a project that entails collecting examples of efforts that people are making towards creating transformation to a better or a more sustainable, equitable planet, and then studying the successes of those efforts. She recently ran a large strategic project in the Montérégie region called Connexion Montérégie, where she worked with local land use planners and other stakeholders to improve landscape management. And to hint at what's to come, she's just finished writing a proposal to grow the Montérégie project by doing it in a variety of different landscapes in Canada. And the goal of the larger project is to improve the management of landscapes and to maximize the benefits they provide to all people. So I'm just going to give maybe a little more personal history just that I've gathered from speaking with Elena, mostly over email. Before coming to McGill, Elena was a postdoc for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is the largest assessment of the state of the planet. That sounds really cool. It involved over 1,400 scientists from nearly 100 countries. She got her PhD and her master's, her MSc from the University of Wisconsin, and her BA at Oberlin College. And she also played piano and soccer, in addition to studying science, which to me indicates, like a lot of women, she took a rather circuitous path towards science, tried a bunch of things out, I guess. Elena has mentioned to me that women in science need to be cowboys. And she didn't really reveal too much more when she said that. She said something about needing to get back on the horse. And so I was thinking about what she meant. My interpretation or my inferences that I can make from that are that women in science experience proportionately greater episodes of getting knocked off the horse. And so I'm interested to hear more about what Elena means by this, but in my own research, I can infer that maybe she's talking about some common issues that women in science face. So, for example, getting off the bike halfway to have a baby, halfway up the hill to have a baby, and then having to pedal like heck to get going again. Having feelings of isolation and imposter syndrome, being the only woman, trying to do something different, which I think we've just discussed is something that's happening, and having to fight against the implicit biases that often render women's work invisible or inferior compared to their male peers in science. So I'm really interested in learning more about what cowboy science for women looks like, and without further ado, here's Elena Bennett.
Great. Thanks, Allison. That was such a nice introduction. I am going to talk about all of those issues, and I'll just start by saying, as you read them out, and I was thinking about my own self halfway up the hill off the bike, and not only having to go downhill a little bit to get up the speed in order to turn around and go back up the hill, but then having someone from the side shouting, your work isn't worthwhile, and sort of trying to push you off the bike while you're trying to get going. And so I'll touch on those a little bit, and sort of how do you deal with having all of those things happening to you at once, because any one of them I think we could solve, because you could say, well, here's a way to solve needing to get up enough speed to be able to pedal the bike. But when it's so many things happening at once, it's not only harder to figure out how to solve, it is in some ways sort of exhausting, just mentally exhausting to think about all of those things that are happening to you. So I'll talk about all of those. I won't talk about the research work that I'm doing, although you're welcome to ask me about that. This is a picture of my lab. I wanted to say it's a recent picture of my lab, and then I realized that the small being in my arms over there on the far right for you is now 10. So it's not quite as recent as I would like to believe. And I don't know what to say about the fact that we're sitting on top of Mont Saint Hilaire having champagne. Whether we always do that or we never do that, I'm not sure. So here's a little just hint of what I want to talk about, and it's really sort of three things that I want to talk about. So first is why diversity, by which I mean women in sustainability science, I mean women in science in general, and I mean all kinds of diversity in science, and why is it important? I want to talk about whether there is, in fact, a problem with diversity, and especially in sustainability science. And then I'm hoping to spend most of my time on this kind of, well, what can we do about it? What can I do about it as an individual for myself? That's where I'm going to talk about cowboy science. I really should have titled this Cowboy Science for Women. I'm definitely recording that for my next talk. What can I do about it as an individual for other people around me? And then, the university as an organization or other organizations, what can other organizations do about it? So let me jump right in. Why do we need women in sustainability science? Why do we need diversity? And what I want to try to convince you of is that it's not just because it's nice, or because we want it, or because there are women who want to be in sustainability science, or because it's the right thing to do. It is because it makes the science better. So if we look at some of the research on this, there was a study that was done in 2010 that asked participants in teams of a variety of different sizes to solve a bunch of different kinds of puzzles. And when they did that, they also looked at people's IQs, and then they took information about how the puzzles were solved and used those to build what they called a collective intelligence factor that had to do with social perceptiveness, it had to do with parity in speaking time and conversational turn taking. And what they found was that collective intelligence factor was a far better predictor of performance than any measures of IQ of any individual group members or the average or median IQ. And so what that says to me is that diversity is fundamentally good. It helps groups solve problems better. And the role of gender in particular in this is that women had higher levels of this social perceptiveness in teams, and teams with women had greater equity and participation. But all women teams and all men teams did not fare so well. So you needed this sort of mix of diversity and types of thinking in order to get that benefit. And we've seen this repeatedly. So there's other studies that show that studies by women or in groups that involve women pose different questions and pose questions differently, and they engage in different topics of research. And in fact, that women leaders often more accurately recognize expertise of fellow team members, and that changes the dynamics of science teams as well. And so, so it makes the science better. And you know, if you think about this logically, if you get a group of people together and you're looking at a problem, everybody's looking at it from their own perspective. If we all were looking at it from one side, like the blind men who are exploring the elephant, if everybody is just looking at the tail, then all you ever get to see is the tail. But if everybody is looking at a different part and you have good communication, then eventually you can suss out that what you are as a group looking at is in fact an elephant. And so my experience, it has been that the more ideas you have in the room, the better your group is going to be. And we see this in particular in sustainability science. So the work that I do in particular in sustainability science is very interdisciplinary. So we rarely come at any problem from a single disciplinary perspective. So we don't just use biology or just use chemistry or just use geology. We're going to use biogeochemistry and try to figure out how these problems can be understood or solved better from a multidisciplinary perspective. And so these are different groups now, SUSINC in Maryland, IDIV in Germany, NCEAS in California, that are actively trying to get groups of researchers from different disciplines. So they're not necessarily focused on gender diversity, but they're focused on disciplinary diversity because they've realized that when we get a diverse group of people in the room, we're better able to solve the kinds of problems that we face in sustainability science. Okay, but before we move too far from that, I do want to point out that simply having diversity in the room doesn't necessarily mean that innovation is going to happen or that the science is going to be better. So this is from a study at Stanford that basically they looked at the sort of diversity in and discovery and innovation out, and discovered that it really wasn't a very simple relationship. In fact, there were all these things that happened in the middle that affected how diversity played out. So the climate affected diversity. So how comfortable people felt speaking and saying what they had to say. Hierarchical structures, and specifically lack of hierarchical structures, played a very important role in ensuring that diversity in led to greater innovation. The availability of methods to use different team expertise. So if there was a lot of exploring different processes, that helped. Critical mass of diversity in the room. Those were all important. And I learned that really strongly in the program where I did my PhD in Wisconsin. So this was a very, very small program in aquatic ecology, and we were all in one building. There were 4 professors and about 20 graduate students. And it was a cool building. We were right on a lake, and so you could drive a boat out of the basement and pretend like you were James Bond. That was my favorite part. And there were lots of spiders because we're right on the lake, so all these bugs are getting blown across the lake into the windows. And so every spring there would be this big spring cleaning to get the spiders off of the windows. And rather than ask the university to do it, the program took it on for itself, and everybody joined in. So there was the director in his jeans and his grubby shirt, cleaning down the windows, and there were the administrative assistants and the graduate students. And it hadn't really occurred to me at the time until my supervisor said, yeah, this is not an accident. This is a very purposeful display of the lack of hierarchy that we have, and that everybody has to play a role in making sure that this program works, from the cleaning the windows all the way on up. And I discovered how it worked in other situations as well. So in that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment project, I worked with many people who were much more hierarchical about structures, and really expected that from the top down they would say how things were going to go. And I had one experience where I had what I thought was a debate with the co-leader of the group that I was working for, and I thought that the end of the debate was that we had agreed that my idea was a good one and we should proceed that way. And he thought that the end of the debate was he's the boss and so he wins no matter what happens in the conversation. And he was very upset with me when I went off and unknowingly did what I thought was the right thing to do. And you know, the lesson there for me was how quickly that took the wind out of my sails. I never came forward with another idea to him ever, because it was very clear that that wasn't going to be accepted, or we weren't going to go anywhere with that. So that was the end of that. So that's the difference, I think, for me with hierarchy and non-hierarchy, and how that influences whether your diversity of people and diversity of ideas leads to discovery and innovation or not. Okay. So I don't want to belabor this too much, so hopefully I have convinced you that diversity is not just the right thing to do, but actually improves the quality of the science and the quality of the ideas. I'm going to guess that just by being in this room, you probably didn't need very much convincing in the first place, but I wanted to make sure that I stopped and made that point before I moved on too far. So. But let me move on to this question of, is there a problem with diversity in sustainability science? And I can tell you here at McGill and in Canada in general, for environment programs, and I think this is true for biology programs too, women are about 60% of the undergrads in the environment. They make up about 50% of the graduate programs in most areas, and about 20% or so of the faculty, with a really sharp decline as you get to higher levels of faculty, as you move from assistant to associate to full professor. So I'll show just a few pieces of information. So this is actually a study in Europe. So all the things at the bottom are names of different countries, but you don't need to look at those. And the bars are the percent of women in grade A positions. So grade A positions here means the sort of highest level faculty job that a woman could get in these different countries. And so what I want you to see from this is that we max out at about 35 or so percent in some countries, and it's as low as 8% in other countries, and the average is maybe, or median is maybe around 18 to 20% women in faculty positions across these places. And I will say that makes a difference. So for me as an undergraduate, I don't remember having any women professors. I'm sure I had a few, but they were very, very few. In graduate school, I had very, very few women professors. Luckily, I had really good supportive mentorship from my male professors, one of whom taught me the term cowboy science and insisted that when you fall off the horse, you get back up every time. And that registered with me in part because that was how I was brought up. I got that message very strongly from my parents, and very strongly, especially from my dad. And there's research that shows, especially for women, that fathers who encourage that sort of persistence is incredibly important for women who grow up to be persistent. So, I never was expected less of me because I was the girl in the family, and when I failed, the response was a pretty universal, like, okay, get up, try it again. And I never got very much more sympathy than that, but I think it was quite effective, sort of long before people were talking about growth mindset or anything like that. I really was brought up with, well, failure, it's not such a big deal. Just get up and keep going. Okay, so what about in North America? So this is actually look at women in astronomy in the U.S., but it shows not only, I think, the small percentage of women, but also that drop-off that I was talking about as you move from graduate students, where women in astronomy make up about 35%, all the way up to full professors, where it's about 15%. And so I can look at this in my department here in Natural Resource Sciences. At McGill, there are 20 professors in that department. We just hired a new woman, so now we are 3, which makes us 15%. And 3, it's a small number, and 2 is a really small number. Luckily, I get along with those other women. They're good mentors to me and good colleagues, but you can imagine if you have only one other woman in your department and you don't get along with her for whatever reason, you are completely lacking community. And I should say, of the 3 of us in our department, none of us are full professors, and that's just been a consistent story for me throughout my career, and we can talk more later about why this is, but for sure, in part, it's because women aren't applying for faculty jobs. So, for example, in chemistry, between 1999 and 2003, women were 32% of the newly minted PhDs during that period, but they only accounted for 18% of applications to tenure-track jobs. So there's something going on there that is causing women to not apply for tenure-track jobs at the same rate that their male counterparts are applying. Okay, so why? Why are there fewer women in science? And so I'm sort of curious to hear from you all just a little bit before I go on with my thoughts. Why do you think that there are about 50% women in graduate school and that big drop-off as we get? Yeah.
There aren't enough women scientists teaching at elementary and secondary school.
Okay, so, and I'm going to repeat just because I have the mic that allows it to be heard back there. So that was not enough women teaching, especially younger kids, elementary, secondary school. They're not seeing anybody. Me?
Yeah, when women grow up, we have more responsibility in the family, and that really takes too much time for them, and they cannot really afford to invest a lot in like teaching and doing science as a faculty member. And of course, there are other challenges as a faculty member as a women. And we don't, I feel that the system doesn't really pay too much attention about the kind of the challenge faced, especially for women, especially for them to take on the challenge in the
Okay, so I think that was I'm going to call that 2 separate things. So one is that whether it's right or fair or not, that women may disproportionately tend to take on more household duties, and it's hard to balance those household duties with duties of science and running a lab. And then the other was that women may face more challenges in their departments or in their fields than other people. Yes?
I have one. The more money involved, the more men tend to dominate.
Okay, so the more money involved, the more men tend to dominate. Yes?
Systemic factors, like science is typically an older men's club, old boys club, not equal pay for women.
Yeah, so not equal pay, the old boys club. Anybody that I'm missing? We're gonna talk about all of these. We'll talk about We'll talk about a few more too. So just a few that I didn't hear that we'll talk about a little bit. Maybe women just aren't as good at science. Maybe. I don't believe it, but maybe. Maybe women aren't doing the right things to get promoted on the jobs. Maybe we're doing too much service or too much taking care of other people and not enough focusing on our own selves. Maybe it's just too hard to be successful. Maybe women look at the job and say, that's not for me. Maybe women have an academic partner like I do, and the partner gets a job and they move to where the partner's job is and there's nothing there for them, and so be it. There's lots and lots of reasons, and I want to go through a few of those and just put some data and some information on them, and then come back to what those imply about what we should be doing about it. But these are all, I think, important. Okay, but I wanted to start with this quote. This is from the U.S. National Science Foundation. So taken as a whole, the body of literature we reviewed provides evidence that women in academic careers are disadvantaged compared with men in similar careers. Women faculty earn less, are promoted less frequently to senior academic ranks, and publish less frequently than their male counterparts. And so our job now for the next few minutes is to try to sort out why. What are all the reasons behind why that's happening? So let me start here. This just was published quite recently. So this is a look at the gender pay gap. So that bottom axis is dollars per year, and then a list of different universities in Canada. And so let me come right to the point right there at McGill. So the McGill gender pay gap is about $17,000 per year. So that means that a man who is standing here in my position would, on average, be making $17,000 more than I am making for doing ostensibly the same job, and arguably probably less job, because there is a lot of evidence that women do more service at every rank that we are not paid for. So that's pretty interesting. On average, in the US, women earn about 8% less in faculty jobs. And just to be clear about this, teaching amounts are set by faculties or departments. So everyone should be teaching the same teaching load. Research productivity, of course, is up to each professor to decide, but all of our raises and awards and recognition and everything else is based on productivity. So you better believe we are all trying to maximize our productivity. And there's lots of evidence that women are doing more than their fair share of service, things like serving on graduate committees, reviewing manuscripts. There's also a lot of evidence that women tend to take on orphaned or abandoned graduate students at much higher rates than men, or even take on graduate students where the male supervisor remains the supervisor on paper because he has a very famous name or is a big shot, and that's much more useful to the student, but the woman professor is doing all of the work of actually supervising despite getting none of the credit. So this to me is pretty interesting, and this is after McGill has recently, I'm trying to remember what year, but since I've been here, McGill went through a whole round of trying to create more equitable pay between men and women, in which they bumped salaries of women to get more equity, and this is data from after that. I want to say that was 2008 or 2009, but I'm not sure. Okay, so you might ask, maybe this is just because the men are more senior, or the men are better at getting grants. So I have data for you, because I always have data. So this is now NSERC. I'm not going to step over there. The graph on the left is, I got this. This graph is natural science research. This graph is social science research. And this x-axis down here is the grant in dollars per year, and this is the salary. And so what you see is the blue lines represent the men and the red lines represent the women. And so at every grant level, no matter how successful the woman is, at every grant level she is still getting paid less than the man who is getting that level of grant. So in other words, is that gender pay gap because of differences in research success? Nope. That is fundamentally the answer here. And in fact, it gets worse on social science. It gets worse for women the more successful they get, because that's those lines diverging there. So success. So let me get into what determines success, because surely women have just as good of a chance at being successful as men, but many studies show that women are actually less likely to succeed in grant applications for men. And so this was a recent study done in Sweden, and it's scientific productivity on the x-axis, which was measured as the numbers of manuscripts and papers that scientists were writing. And then they were graded in a competence score by other researchers in their field. In other words, how you're looking at this CV, how competent is this person? And so what this says is basically women have to be 2.5 times as productive as their male counterparts to be considered equally competent. So in a world where we are constantly on a treadmill of trying to compete to show that we are successful, and you have to be 2.5 times better. So now not only do I have to get back on my bike, I have to be 2.5 times faster as the guy next to me who didn't have to get off his bike. And why this happens basically is because peer review is biased. And much as I would love to pin this on, it's the guys reading these who are biased, the women are just as bad. So if I showed you just these graphs that were reviewed given competence scores by women, we also rate other women lower than we rate their male counterparts. And in fact, we're worse than the guys. So it's not just on the guys, it's on all of us. And there was a study a few years ago where they handed out CVs, and same exact CV, but they would either put Michael or Mary at the top, and people reviewed those CVs completely differently. They were much more likely to hire the CV with the male name at the top than they were to hire the CV with the female at the top, even though everything else was exactly the same. And there's been a lot of discussion now about, well, what can we do about this? And you know, for some manuscripts, we do what's called double-blind review. So the person who submitted the paper doesn't see who's reviewing it, and the person who's reviewing it doesn't see a name at the top of the paper. That turns out is really hard for grants, because part of what you're trying to judge somebody on is their previous success, and then you need to see what papers they've written and what they've done. And even if you were to take my CV and take my name off of it, anybody could do a Google search on any of the titles of the papers and know immediately it was me. Even if they didn't do that, they might know immediately that it was me. So this is a very tricky problem to try to solve, because we don't have a good way to solve it other than to say, hey, we all do this, and the next time I look at a CV or something, I should be aware that I'm probably doing it and try to not do it. But that's not a very satisfying solution. Okay, so that's success. That's success in Sweden. Let me talk about success in Canada. So there's a lot going on here. This is grants in the natural sciences. On the top is 2009, and on the bottom is 2013. And so on the left-hand side, you're seeing just success rates. Yes or no, how much success was there? And there's a few interesting things. So one is from 2009 to 2013, the overall success rate goes down from that line at 70%, it goes down to about 60%. But overall, it's reasonably similar between male and female applicants, except in that renewal, which is kind of interesting, because that renewal, that's the first time you're going back to to re-up. It's probably right about when you're applying for tenure. It might be correlating or overlapping with when a family is happening. And so that's a really important stage. And so it's a little, even though it's not much lower for the women than for the men, it disturbs me that it is lower at all, because that's a very important stage for career establishment. And then if you look at the right, that is then looking at how much money did men and women get in those grants. And there you really see a difference. Basically, at every stage of the game, men are getting more money from their discovery grant, which is basically the bread and butter for us in sustainability science and natural science. The average is about $6,000 less, and in a grant of about $30,000, $6,000 less makes a really big difference. So the issues that we see with women getting smaller grants and is not just an issue in other places, it's an issue everywhere. Okay, so we're paid less, that stinks. We're less successful at getting grants. When we do get them, we're probably getting less money. That stinks too. Maybe the problem is that women behave differently. Maybe there's something about gender and gender differences that leads to these different outcomes that we see. So now I'm going to talk about a study that was done by some professors at MIT in conjunction with a private company. And what they did was they had people at this company wear these sociometric badges, so that you had a name badge. It looked like everybody else's name badge, but it measured things. It measured your movement. It measured your proximity to other badges. It measured speech, volume, and tone, but not content. So the researchers could tell who was talking to whom. They could tell where people were communicating. They could tell who was dominating the conversations. So they could address this hypothesis that maybe women have fewer mentors. Maybe we have less face time with managers or senior staff. Maybe we're not as proactive about talking to senior leadership. So that's what these guys were doing with this study. Okay, so what do they find? There is no perceptible difference, or there was none in this company, pretty well-known company, in differences in the behavior of men and women. So in other words, they had the same number of contacts. They had the same time with senior leadership. They allocated their time similarly. In other words, the way they spent their time working was quite similar. They received statistically identical performance evaluations. So in other words, management judged them as being the same, and yet the women weren't advancing. So this is a company, I'm going to try to remember the numbers, but I want to, whatever the numbers were, there was a much higher rate of women in the lower status than at the higher status. Women basically fell out of the ranks as they got to the top. And so the study was trying to look at why does that happen? So why are men making it into senior leadership and not women? And these researchers basically said, listen, it's bias, pure and simple. There is nothing that we can measure that is different about what these women are doing, how they're behaving, how they're allocating their time. And in fact, when we look in science and in sustainability science, in every criterion on which scientists are evaluated for hiring, for promotion, for talk invitations, or for prizes, everyone that has been looked at has been shown to be biased in favor of men and usually in favor of white men. Those include things like authorship credit, paper citations, funding, recruitment, mentoring, tenure. And to me, what that suggests when I start to think about, well, what do we do about this? That arguments about lean in or change your behavior are missing some kind of bigger picture. There's a bigger picture going on there about gender equality and bias that isn't being dominated by behavior. There are other explanations. It could be in this particular company that women are leaving to have families, and so they're not making it to senior leadership. And there's no way for this study to tell that, because either the women were working there or not working there. But if you argue that men and women are should be equal partners at home, shouldn't they be leaving the workforce at equal rates? I know they're not, but we could make that argument. So let's look at some of that data on why that happens. So this is a study done by Heather Sarsens, who was a PhD study in economics and a fellow in the Harvard Kennedy School. They have an interdisciplinary program on inequality and social policy. And so she was working there, and she was wondering about this feeling that when she talked to other women in economics, that they felt shortchanged when it came to recognition in their fields. And she started to wonder about why, why we have this uptick of women in doctoral programs, but why are they still underrepresented in faculty? And so research papers are super critical to getting tenure. That's the main thing that our departments are looking at. And so she looked at data on publishing records in economics, and especially whether differences in how co-authored publications are received makes the difference. So on the left, you see the number of papers that people in the department she looked at had published when they went up for tenure. So for men, a total of 8.8 on average. For women, 8.2. A little over 5 co-authored, a little more co-authored for the men, and 3.1 solo authored. And yet women are only getting tenure 52% of the time, and men are getting tenure 77% of the time. So something here, I'm getting the looks from the audience, like something doesn't add up. And so what she found was that co-authored papers had a much weaker effect on a women's record than they did on a man's record. In other words, a co-authored paper for a man was just as good as having a solo authored paper because people looked at it and assumed that the man did the work. But a co-authored paper for a woman, they assumed that the man did the work and she didn't get credit for it essentially. And so this is something that's slightly different in sustainability science because we tend to list authors in an order that indicates something about how much participation somebody did. So the first author is the person who led the study, maybe the last author is the senior person in the lab, and then everybody else is in order based on their contribution. But in economics, it's done in alphabetical order, so there's no way to tell. And so it leads to this issue where women are getting just systematically undervalued for work. They're not getting credit. And so as we see this interdisciplinary science and moving towards more group projects, that is going to bias women even more. Okay, so I wanted to have this quote by Meg Early. So people have just a little more certainty that a man is a genius and a little more doubt that a woman will make the grade. Her contribution to the paper was it her student's brilliance or her husband's work? Her work is risky and unlikely to succeed, whereas his is revolutionary. Hers is pedestrian, while his is reliable. Men have champions, and women have critics. And that, the comment about brilliance that made people laugh, I had a mentor, not my PhD supervisor, but another mentor who was famous for saying that his male graduate students, wait, let me get this right. His female graduate students were twice as good as they thought they were, and his male grad students were half as good as they thought they were, that there was just a systematic underestimation of their abilities by women. This plays out in our letters of recommendation. They are shorter for women. They are filled with different adjectives. We get less brilliant, creative for women and more passionate, helpful, hardworking. Women's letters are more likely to mention personal characteristics, like they're helpful, or she did all of this while raising kids. And that is true whether the letter writer is male or female. So there are now websites where you can check your recommendation letters for bias and make sure that you haven't accidentally included too many female words in your letter. Okay, I don't want to belabor this too much, but we have really interesting evidence from people like Ben Barres, who was a female-to-male transgendered person, recently passed away, but very, very much beloved in his field, who really became an advocate for women, saying things like, people who don't know that I'm transgendered, I can get a whole sentence out before I get interrupted. And he talked a lot about this idea that we used to tell that men were more biologically predisposed to systematize or analyze, more forgetful of others, and saying, nah, that's just not real. What's real is that we're unconsciously raising the bar for women and for minorities so that it's harder for them to emerge as winners, and we're doing it over and over again, and that reduces women's self-confidence. Okay, so I want to talk about all of this, and what do we do about all of this? What do we do about any of these issues? And I want to say that it's not just any one issue. You know, a lot of people will say, well, it's just all about bias, or it's just all about family issues. But if it was just all about family issues, then why does Sweden, that has 18 months of parental leave, why are they lagging behind in women? Why are certain fields like astronomy, why does astronomy have twice as many women as physics? You know, so it isn't just about any one thing. The truth is that it's all of these things interacting in really complicated ways. You know, so women get a close look at the job of being a professor and say, this is not for me. And I have to say, I was there as a grad student. I looked at the women in my department who were working till 11 o'clock or midnight and went, yeah, I don't know. They look at it and they say, I have to work twice as hard to succeed. I don't see anyone who looks like me. Maybe I'm not even safe here. I'm tired of having my papers rejected. This stinks. There's no mentor to support me. I'm not good enough. I have imposter syndrome. I want a family I'm not sure I can balance. And so this is where we get to this part where we're on the bike, and there's someone pushing us off from one side and telling us we're not good enough from the other side. There's people pushing back at us with not writing good recommendation letters. If it were only any one of these things, it would be easy to solve. Okay, but I do want to talk about a couple things of what we can do about it. So one is just visibility. This book, The Door and the Dream, has been super influential for me. It's a woman who interviewed 66 of the 86 women at the time in the US National Academy of Sciences and just looked at their career paths. And these are fascinating stories. They're told in chronological order, so you can see the women who started in the 1920s, it's by birth year, so were born in the 1920s, and worked as technicians in their husband's lab until their husband passed away, and then took over the lab, and then eventually became so prominent they got elected to the National Academy of Sciences, to some of the more recent women who went in 50-50 with their husbands and shared positions. They each took half a position and shared them. So super interesting to me. And the things that come out for me from those stories, okay, talent and intelligence are clearly important, but way more than that, what rises to the top of all of these stories is flexibility and incredible perseverance. Every one of these stories is a woman who just stuck it out. They often had critical encouragement, either from a family member, from a mentor, or from a spouse, or often from all three, who made it very clear that this myth that women don't belong in science is a myth and should be ignored. And then it exposes many other myths, because these women were married. Some of them had 4, 5, 6 kids. They did many different things. There's no rule here that says that being a woman in science means that you need to have total devotion at the expense of everything else. Okay. So what can you do as an individual for yourself? So one thing I think is educate yourself about bias, especially some of the more implicit bias. So this isn't necessarily someone slamming the door in your face and saying you don't belong. It's many little things. Force yourself to be as much as a cowboy as you can and get back up on the bike. Look for mentors who can support you, either in real life or online. I have a great community of women scholars on Twitter that are my lifeline. Don't take rejections personally. Find a very supportive life partner, and be really lucky. I think those are all things that have been really important to me in my career. What can you do for others? Because I think that's also equally important. So one is to be aware of bias and speak out when you see it. I think a lot of times we think that's not my role, I'm going to wait for somebody else to say something, but it's important to speak out. It's important to check your own bias, to go on those websites and make sure you're writing good recommendation letters, serving as a mentor for a younger colleague, being a better partner at home, or finding better partnership through communication at home is really important. And then teaching confidence, I think, from an early age, many girls get the message that either that they're smart, which it turns out that telling girls that they're smart decreases their confidence because they don't learn that failure is okay. But we tell girls both that they're smart, which decreases their confidence, and that they're not clever enough to make it in science, which must be just very confusing. And then I want to talk just 2 slides about what universities can do, and then I will stop. Universities can take a very hard line, in other words, fire people who harass or intimidate younger or less powerful members of the university. We're starting to see that, although I will say that people who are getting fired are getting hired in other jobs at other universities, because they're often very high-flying professors with lots of grant money. We can enhance fairness in competitive selection for both awards and for hiring to make sure that those processes focus on diversity. We can stop holding meetings at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock or after hours when parents, men and women, need to be home with their kids. You wouldn't believe how many meetings I miss because they're not at a time that I can make work. And we can even out expectations for service. Oh, and find ways to promote alternative career paths. So, for example, there's a new program that's offering grants to women who are returning to science after long maternity leaves that helps generate a little bit of that momentum to get back on the bike. Just a couple more of those. Making sure there are visible, diverse role models. And helping women balance career and family members. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can make sure that it is easier for women to balance their family roles and their work roles. And we can offer longer and paid paternity leave, and we can actually encourage people to take it rather than discouraging people to take it. So Sweden now, I just got back from sabbatical there. Sweden offers 18 months of leave, but you only get the last 4 months if it is split between the parents. So the guys have to take 4 months of the leave at least, or you lose out on paid leave. And so you commonly see cafes full of guys with strollers with their little babies because that's what they're doing. And once it becomes the norm, then it's easier for guys to do. They don't feel like they're going to lose out on their career. And then finally, and I'll end on this, is to just simply create a more humane workplace, which I would argue would be better for everyone. A workplace in which the impact and the quality of your work have greater weight than some sort of monastic devotion and 100-hour work weeks. So let me end on that, and I will take questions.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I wanted to mention there was a slide that you had talked about, or something that somebody had said to you, that the men in the program think that they're twice as good, and there was actually a study that just came out just a couple of days ago that said the exact thing for I think it was undergraduate students, that the men overestimated their competence in science specifically, and that the women underestimated their competence.
Excellent. I'll have to tell Buzz. He was right all along. I mean, he was telling me that in the 1990s. That was his impression.
And the thing that you said about brilliance, too, is really resonated for me, because there was another study that came out, I think it was in 2015, that showed that boys and girls at the age of 5 think that men and women and boys and girls are equally brilliant. Mm-hmm. But then when they turn 6, something happens, and they probably go to school and begin interacting with other kids and with teachers, and girls start thinking that boys and men are more brilliant than girls and women are. And that was a study that came out, I think, in 2015. And so that idea of brilliance is really this interesting cultural construct that we've ascribed to gender. Which is very, very problematic, especially in the sciences, which is seen, where people are really seen as having to be brilliant to be successful. Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes for questions.
This problem of not getting equal pay for equal work, how does the university justify, I mean, let's just, for example, third-year associate professor, male or female, how does the university justify that they're not getting the same, they're salaried? Now, perhaps grants play into it, but are the salaries different for a third-year assistant professor based
Well-
on, I mean, is there not a pay scale somewhere?
So we get every year the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile pay rate for every rank of professor in every faculty. So you know exactly where you are on the scale, and I can tell you, I mean, maybe I'm just a terrible researcher, but I did just win this award that only 6 people in Canada get every year. But I am paid in the 25th percentile of my department, despite being more senior for my rank and winning this award.
How does the university justify that?
I don't know that they do, and I don't know that most of us, like everybody, when I look at it, I see me and my individual thing, and I rarely think about what does this look like at the whole of the university. And that study with the $17,000 difference at McGill actually really surprised me.
Yeah.
Because you think like, oh, well, that's just me, and maybe I didn't negotiate hard enough when I took my job, or I haven't negotiated hard enough for raises.
When you first started your job, that there was, first, this is what you're, what it is for a first-year professor. You're starting your job, this is the pay,
Right.
and it doesn't matter what sex you are. You might have grants from other things, or, which I can understand, but your base salary, I just, out in the world,
Right. But it's merit-based, and unfortunately, the way the university's judging merit is biased. And so I would be interested to see, these universities didn't show up in that, but there are universities, especially in Quebec, that are unionized, where the salary is presumably set by years of experience, and I would be curious if they are more equal. I don't think they're equal. So my husband used to work at one of those universities, and they gave him so many extra years of experience. They counted all of his years as a TA and all of his years as a graduate student, even though they overlapped. He got 6 years instead of 3 of experience. So there's ways to, even though they say everybody comes in the same, there's ways to game that system as well, and that's all about negotiating prowess and.
Yeah, like workload allocation and maybe non-monetary things as well that
Yeah.
you might accrue. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and men demand more when they come. But
Yes.
the dilemma when you're applying for a grant is, do I apply for the same amount that my male colleague applied for and then not get it? Or do I pitch it low? What's your advice?
Oh my God. So that question about, so when you're writing a grant for the non-scientists in the room, you make a budget for what you want to do, and you have to ask for a certain amount of money, and you're always asking for more than what you think you need because you know you're not going to get it all, but then you are trying to adjust to what is the reasonable expectation for me at my career stage. And the question really comes down to is, what is the reasonable expectation for me at my career stage and given my gender? And do you adjust for that or not? So my cowboy science advice is no. Do it anyway. So when I applied for, or I asked my department to nominate me for that Stacy Fellowship, and many extremely well-meaning people who have been very good mentors to me here at this university said, you will never get it. Don't waste your time. And it was completely good-meaning advice. And if I had listened to them, I wouldn't have gotten it and I wouldn't be here. But I don't know how do you decide when it's worth it to do that? Because it's not worth it to do it all the time. I can't do that 100% of the time. It happened to be worth it in that case. But how do you know? It's an unanswerable question. My tendency is always to just be gutsy and be a cowboy, because that's what I was taught is the right thing to do. But I do sometimes get slapped around for it too. For sure, I get, told that's not the right thing to do, and you're being too aggressive, or we don't like you very much, and I've just decided I don't care. But then you gotta stand up there and not care.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really, really great talk. I just have something to add to that. The study that you showed with the U15 universities and the gender pay gap. I shared that on social media a little while ago when I first came out, and I got a comment from a UBC prof who said that there's data showing that even when the institutions intervene and try to remedy the pay gap, the pattern reestablishes itself within 5 years. So I don't have the specific data to back that up, but this was a comment that was left in my social media, and I thought that was
Okay.
something that stuck with me, and I thought I'd share that.
And so that would indicate that could happen in one of two ways. So either the women who are coming in are not getting an equal salary right when they start, and so that would cause that, or the women aren't getting promoted and getting raises at the same rate, right? So every year you have some sort of merit assessment and you're getting a raise, and if the women are getting 10% less over 5 years.
Yeah. So the system is really resilient. So
In a bad way.
yeah. And my question is related to that. I recently organized a small event where we put out a call to mostly, our participants ended up being mostly female graduate students, but just students who are interested in talking about gender barriers for women, or gender barriers in general in STEM fields, and to talk about the difficulties that they faced or that they anticipate facing as they're kind of progressing and pursuing their careers. And it's clear that women at the student level and the early career scientist, postdoc level are very aware of what they're up against. And I'm just wondering what you think, let's say personally me as a student, as a graduate student, what do you think I should be doing, or students should be doing to try and help progress in this respect?
For yourself or for everybody?
For everybody. Or is there anything that I should be doing?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things. So I think one thing is really steeling yourself to be as gutsy as you can is important for you as an individual, because, you know, papers get rejected, grants get rejected. It stinks, right? There's people are yelling at you and pushing at you from all sides, and there's a real decision fatigue in that. So I think that as an individual is really important. What would I do as a graduate student? I think, you know, finding mentors and finding ways to support yourself with mentors or other colleagues is really important. I don't know what to do to change the system from that level, other than just making sure that you're not part of that system in the ways that we all are, right? That we tend to be biased, all of us, men and women. Yeah. That's not a very satisfying answer, but.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is around family planning, babies. So I will be stepping into a postdoc position that turns into a tenure track position very soon. So I've started to try to plan my personal life. So I start doing this math, like, okay, 9 months from today, where will I be, and will that be a good time? Should I try to do it early on, like once I'm more established? And it just seems like it's not,
No.
like, because even though I'll be this is in the Netherlands where, you know, there's maternity leave and all those things, but then when you come back from maternity leave, you still have to like hop on that bike and catch, I mean, supposedly the tenure tracks clock stops and all that, but in the end, I don't know, it just doesn't seem, it seems like either your family suffers or your job suffers, or I don't know, what advice do you have for me?
My honest advice, there is no good time, just do it. Just do, and you can't plan it anyway. So just forget all of that, and I think there isn't a good time. I think being aware of what you're going to face is good. And then I asked loads of people for, what did you do? What did you do that worked? What did you do that didn't work? What do you wish you'd done differently? I have always just spent lots of time asking other people what they've done, because it's such a rich source of information, especially when you get to the Netherlands, because people are going to say, oh, there's this policy that you've never heard of, and you should definitely take advantage of that, or there's that, or whatever. And that can be men or women who will have great advice and ideas for you. So just ask as much as you can, and know that there is no good time, or they're all good times. If there's no good time, it's the same thing as it all being a good time. So.
Thanks, Elena.
Yeah.
It's a comment and a question at the same time, because sometimes when I listen this kind of talks, I end up thinking that maybe I should be more authoritative, more competitive, because I am not sure if I understood very well the cowboy approach, but it's like, but maybe I don't feel comfortable being like that, and maybe I don't like to be like that, and I prefer to continue being, because I have never negotiated my salary. And then when I talk with my partner, for example, it's like, why? Because I was more concerned about what I have to do and not about the money. Maybe I am silly, I don't know. But
Yep.
So sometimes there is like an identity conflict there too, that is like more, is deeper than many of the things we are thinking here that are also important, but it's like, so your opinion about that?
Yeah, so that's a hard one for me, because I definitely, that sort of cowboy it's a good fit for me as a human being. I don't have to work hard to be in that. I have to work a little hard, but I don't have to work really hard to be in that place. But I recognize that other people do, and so maybe the answer there is to find people who are like you, or pathways that suit that. So I don't know that everybody has to be a cowboy in the sense of being really aggressive. I think you probably have to be a cowboy and being willing to have papers and grants rejected and still get back up and try again. But I do think that there is a place for everybody, even if you're not gonna aggressively negotiate your salary, if you know that that's who you are and you find a route that works. But then I would say, find people who are also taking that route, and same thing, ask them loads of questions about what works.
Okay, so thank you. Ingrid, did you?
There's a gift. Elena
Oh.
saw it.
Oh.
It's behind here, I also saw it.
So,
So I'd like to thank Elena Bennett for
you.
talking about how to be a cowboy and a woman, and how to negotiate that in successful ways. And
thank you very much.
for-
Super fun. Thank you. And thanks
I
to,
get to thank all of you. I get to thank Allison and Elena, our technicians, and all of you. We'll see you for the
Well,
very, very last one.
and we
Because
thank you,
may not
Ingrid,
do
for-
mini science again.
we thank you for putting this all on, because
You're
it's
welcome.
great. It's a super series.
I've been doing it since 2006. I've loved every year that we've had mini science. So next week there will be an overall evaluation where you get to tell us whether it's worth it, whether it's not, whether we should sunset it, or maybe there's another approach. Maybe it's not evening, maybe it's something else. Mini science in another way. You are welcome to come.
Cool.
You are all the moderators. I will be sending out a special to come to the last one. Anna Hargraves, she was hired in 2015. She's the speaker next week. She is our youngest scientist in this series. See you back here next Wednesday. Safe
And she's
home.
great.